I want you to close your eyes for a moment. Not fully, not yet. Just let them soften. Let the edges of the room you're in blur a little. Let the weight of whatever day you have had begin to lift, just slightly, off your shoulders. Because I need you somewhere else right now. I need you 66 million years ago. Not in a laboratory, not watching a documentary with bright flashing graphics and dramatic music. I need you there, present. Standing at the edge of something so immense, so quietly catastrophic, that the word extinction almost fails to capture it. Almost. My name does not matter. What matters is that I have spent a long time sitting with this story, reading it, turning it over, holding it up to the light. And the more I look at it, the more I realize it is not really a story about death. It is a story about survival. And maybe, just maybe, it is a story about us. So settle in, get comfortable, breathe slowly. Let the night wrap around you like something warm and ancient. Let your muscles release one by one, starting at the tops of your shoulders, traveling down through your arms, across your chest, into your lower back, into your legs, all the way down to the soles of your feet, and let me take you back to a world that was already very old when the sky fell. I want you to picture a morning, not a morning like the ones you know, not alarm clocks and coffee and pale light through curtains. This is a morning 66 million years in the past, and it belongs to a world so different from ours that standing inside it would feel like standing inside a dream. The air is thick, heavy, not unpleasant. There is something almost tropical about it, a warmth that sinks into the bones, a humidity that makes every breath feel full and rich. You're standing on the edge of what will one day be called the Western Interior Seaway, a vast and shallow body of water that splits the North American continent clean in half. It stretches from what will one day become the Gulf of Mexico all the way north to what will one day become the Arctic Ocean. But right now there are no names for any of this. It is just water, silver and still in the early light, the surface of it barely moving, catching the first pale colour of dawn, and around you, on the banks, in the forests, out across the broad floodplains that stretch away in every direction, life is absolutely, overwhelmingly everywhere. I find myself pausing on this every single time I think about it. We talk about the late Cretaceous as if it was some barren, violent wasteland, all teeth and thunder and extinction waiting to happen. But that was not what it was. Not at all. The late Cretaceous was one of the most biodiverse, most lush, most ecologically complex periods in the entire history of this planet. It was a world at the height of its powers, a world that had been refining itself and diversifying and elaborating itself for millions upon millions of years, and that had arrived at something genuinely extraordinary. The forests were ancient beyond imagining. Angiosperms, the flowering plants, had only arrived relatively recently in geological terms, perhaps 100 million years before this morning. And in that 100 million years, they had transformed the world completely. Before them, the landscape was dominated by ferns and conifers and cycads and ginkgos, beautiful in their own way, but austere. The arrival of flowering plants changed everything. Suddenly the world was colour. Suddenly the world was fragrance. Suddenly there were fruits and seeds wrapped in sugary flesh, and relationships between plants and animals that were intricate and mutual, and almost impossibly complex. You can smell the flowers from where you are standing. It is subtle at first. The morning dew dampens everything, muffling the scent, keeping it close to the ground. But as the sun begins to rise and the air warms, the fragrance begins to lift and spread. Something sweet, something earthy underneath it. The bark of nearby trees releasing oils into the warming air, the smell of wet soil and the faint mineral tang of the water. Close your eyes and breathe it in. And the insects, I want you to really hear them. Because in the late Cretaceous, insects were everywhere. Beetles and wasps and early bees and moths and dragonflies the size of your hand. The whole buzzing, clicking, humming symphony of insect life that we sometimes overlook when we think about dinosaurs. The insects are here first. They will be here long after everything changes. But right now, in this morning, they are simply background music, white noise, the sound the world makes when it is alive and thriving and full of itself. Now, stop, Hear that? Something large is moving through the tree line to your left. Do not panic. I want you to stay very still, stay very calm, and just watch. Because what emerges from the edge of the forest is not a predator, it is a hadrosaur, a duck-billed dinosaur, one of the most abundant creatures in this part of the world. It moves with the easy, unhurried confidence of an animal that knows this territory intimately, that has been living in this place, or one very much like it, for longer than the human species has existed. Its skin is rough and patterned, not the dull grey of old paintings and old models, something more nuanced, more complex. Patches of darker pigmentation along the flanks, lighter along the belly, a face that somehow manages to suggest both great age and great calm. It barely glances at you. If you enjoy listening to sleepy prehistoric stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this every week. It knows you are there, I think. It assesses you in a fraction of a second and concludes that you're not a threat and not prey, and therefore not worth its attention. And it moves on, slow and massive and utterly at home, toward the water at the edge of the seaway where the grasses and ferns grow thick and green. And this is the thing about the late Cretaceous that I think gets lost in all the drama of what comes next. This world worked. It was a functioning, breathing, self-sustaining system of extraordinary elegance. The hadrosaurs cropped the vegetation, and the vegetation grew back. The insects pollinated the flowering plants, and the flowering plants fed the insects and everyone else. The small mammals in their underground burrows ate seeds and insects and provided food for the smaller predators, and the great carnivores, the tyrannosaurs and the abelisaurids and the rest, moved through it all like slow and inevitable forces of natural selection, keeping populations in balance, shaping the evolutionary trajectories of everything they touched. There is a Tyrannosaurus rex somewhere in this ecosystem. Right now, I would estimate she is sleeping. Apex predators often sleep a great deal. The energy cost of being that large, of moving that much mass, means they spend a remarkable proportion of their lives in a kind of patient stillness, conserving what they have consumed. She's probably lying in a depression somewhere in the shadowed forest, her enormous ribcage rising and falling with slow and measured breath. Flies circle her massive head. Small scavengers keep a respectful distance. She does not know what is coming. None of them do. And that is the part of this story that gets to me, if I am being fully honest with you. The complete and total unknowing of it. The morning I have just described to you, a morning just like any other morning in this ancient world, with its insects and its hadrosaurs and its drowsing apex predators and its silver seaway in the early light, was probably very similar to the morning of the impact itself. The world did not tense before it happened. There was no ominous stillness, no gathering darkness on the horizon that animals could point to and say, "There, that is the thing that will end us." There was just a morning, unremarkable and ordinary, until the instant it was not. But let us not go there yet. Let me take you deeper into this world first. I want you to feel the full weight of what existed before, because that is the only way to really understand what was lost, and what, remarkably, was not. The continent you're standing on, which geologists call Laramidia, the western landmass that existed when the interior seaway divided North America, is a rich and complicated place. In the north, the climate is cooler. There are forests of dawn redwoods and broadleaf deciduous trees, species that can handle the long winter darkness of higher latitudes. There are herds of ceratopsians up there, Triceratops relatives, their faces armoured with elaborate frills and horns that seem almost absurdly ornate, until you understand that they are not just weapons but signals, displays, social tools refined over millions of years of competing for mates and territory. The males lock horns in contests that shake the ground. The herds move through the northern forest like thunder made slow and visible. Moving south, the climate warms. The forests thicken and become richer, more layered, more complex in structure. The waterways multiply, braiding through the lowlands in complex deltas and oxbow lakes, and marshes full of turtles and early crocodilians. Here the hadrosaurs are most abundant. Edmontosaurus, Anatotitan, vast herds moving through the riparian corridors, calling to each other in low resonant notes that carry for miles through the heavy air. These calls are something we can barely imagine. They used hollow crests and resonating chambers in their skulls to produce sounds that researchers believe were deep and rich and complex. The herds communicated constantly, keeping track of each other, warning of predators, maintaining the social bonds that kept them safe, and at the southern end of Laramidia, near the shallow margins of the inland sea, in the place you might think of as primordial Louisiana or primordial Texas, the world becomes almost jungle-like, dense and dark and dripping with moisture. The trees are enormous, their canopies so thick that the forest floor below lives in a permanent dim green twilight. Mosasaurs patrol the coast, massive marine reptiles with double-hinged jaws and paddle-like flippers, cutting through the warm, shallow water with a fluid and serpentine grace that no modern animal quite captures. They are the apex predators of this interior sea, and they know it. Nothing in these waters challenges them. Pterosaurs wheel overhead in the coastal thermals, and at the top of that extraordinary family Quetzalcoatlus, a creature so enormous that its wingspan reaches the length of a small aircraft. Standing on the ground, it would be as tall as a modern giraffe. Looking at it from below, with its shadow sliding across the water as it banks on a thermal, it would look like a flying animal from a dream. Something too large to be real. I always stop on Quetzalcoatlus. I think it is one of the most extraordinary animals that ever existed, and I do not think it gets nearly enough attention. When you picture the prehistoric sky, you probably picture pterosaurs as small, bat-like things. Not Quetzalcoatlus. It was a giant, an absolute giant, and it was everywhere in the late Cretaceous landscape of North America, a slow-moving aerial predator that could travel enormous distances on those vast wings, touching down on the plains to feed in ways that researchers are still debating. All of this, the hadrosaurs and the tyrannosaurs and the pterosaurs and the vast shallow sea and the flowering forests and the ancient insects, all of it was operating in a state of dynamic and intricate balance. Not peaceful exactly. Life is never quite peaceful, but stable, functional, old. The dinosaur lineage by this point had existed for over 160 million years. Think about that number for a moment. 160 million years. Our own species, Homo sapiens, is perhaps 300,000 years old. The dinosaurs had been on this earth for more than 500 times as long as we have. When you look at a tyrannosaur skeleton in a museum, you're not looking at something that lived a long time ago and then failed and disappeared. You are looking at the endpoint of 160 million years of success, 160 million years of adaptation and refinement and diversification. That is what was on Earth when the asteroid arrived. They were not newcomers struggling to find their footing. They were ancient beyond our comprehension. They had survived ice ages and volcanic eruptions and shifting continents and changing seas. They had diversified and specialized and radiated into almost every available ecological role on the planet. They were the world. The land belonged to them in a way that is difficult to fully articulate. And then something arrived from the sky, something very small by cosmic standards, something very large by every other standard. I want you to breathe slowly with me for a moment. We are going to get to the impact. We are going to stand very close to that moment, but I want us to approach it gently. Not as a dramatic explosion, not as a spectacle, but as something that happened to an inhabited world. A world full of living things going about their lives on what began as an ordinary morning. Imagine the last full day before the impact. A hadrosaur somewhere on the banks of the inland seaway raises its head from the water where it has been feeding and looks out across the still silver surface. Something moves in the grasses on the far bank, probably just the wind. It goes back to feeding. A small mammal, one of the Similesta or something like it, shuffles through the leaf litter of the forest floor in the purple dusk, collecting seeds, doing what it does every evening. It is about the size of a shrew. Its eyes are large for its body, adapted for the dim conditions of the nocturnal world it has carved out for itself in the margins of the dinosaur's domain. It finds the seeds it is looking for and retreats to its burrow, a network of shallow tunnels under the roots of a large conifer. The last Quetzalcoatlus of the day banks slowly above the cooling sea, riding the last thermals of the afternoon. Below it, the surface of the water glitters in the low, golden light. It descends slowly toward its overnight roosting place on a coastal cliff. A Tyrannosaurus pauses at the edge of a shallow river crossing, one enormous foot lifted. The water swirls cold and dark around the foot she has left in the current. She stands there for a long moment, perfectly still, head slightly tilted, listening. Something has moved in the forest on the far bank, but then it stops, and after a while she crosses without event. None of them know. The night comes, as it always has. The insects shift from their daytime chorus to their nighttime one. The hadrosaurs settle into their familiar communal resting places. The small mammals emerge from their burrows into the dark. The stars appear above the inland sea, cold and remote and indifferent, as they always have. In the morning, everything will change. But for now, let the night hold all of it. Let the sounds of the late Cretaceous world carry you somewhere quiet. The insects, the water, the distant call of something large moving through the darkness. You're safe here. You're a visitor, watching from outside time. Nothing here can touch you. Rest here, just for a moment, in that last ordinary night. There is a particular quality to the silence just before everything changes. I've read accounts of great catastrophes from throughout human history, volcanic eruptions and earthquakes, and moments when the ordinary world tilts suddenly into something unrecognizable. And the thing that comes up again and again in almost every account is that silence, that fractional pause between the normal world and the transformed one, like the held breath at the top of a wave before it crashes. Did the animals feel it? We will never know for certain, but the evidence suggests that for most creatures on Earth that morning, there was simply no warning at all, no change in the electromagnetic field that their nervous systems could detect, no trembling of the ground that arrived before the impact itself. The asteroid, which we now call the Chicxulub impactor after the Mexican town near where it struck, was travelling at roughly 20 kilometers per second when it entered Earth's atmosphere. 20 kilometers per second. At that speed, there was no approach. There was no warning that would have been intelligible to any organism on Earth. By the time the object was close enough to affect the local environment, the event had already happened. I want you to understand the scale of what I'm describing, and I want you to understand it not as an abstract number, but as something felt and embodied. The Chicxulub impactor was approximately 10 to 15 kilometers across. For reference, the island of Manhattan is about 21 kilometers long. We are talking about an object roughly half the size of Manhattan, travelling at 20 kilometers per second into a shallow carbonate sea near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula. The impact released energy equivalent to approximately 100 trillion tons of TNT, an energy release roughly 10 billion times greater than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. These numbers stop meaning anything after a while. They become just numbers. They become abstract in the way that all enormous things eventually become abstract when you try to hold them in a mind that evolved to understand things at human scale. So let me try to describe what it was actually like. The first thing that happened was the entry. The asteroid, screaming through the atmosphere, at 20 kilometers per second, compressed the air in front of it so rapidly that the air itself began to heat. By the time the impactor was a few dozen kilometers above the surface, the air compressed before it was already superheated, incandescent, bright as a second sun. Anything within a line of sight to this descending object would have seen the sky brighten, suddenly and intensely, in the direction of what is now Mexico, and then the impact itself. The shock wave moved outward from the impact site at supersonic speed. The ground itself rebounded. The shallow sea vaporized. Millions of tons of rock were flash melted and ejected into the upper atmosphere in a matter of seconds, a glowing curtain of debris arcing up and outward from the impact site across the entire planet. At the impact site, a crater began to form. The ground deformed under forces so immense that solid rock behaved like a liquid. A transient crater perhaps 40 kilometers deep and 150 kilometers across formed and then collapsed back on itself in a process that took only minutes. The final crater, the Chicxulub structure, is about 190 kilometers in diameter. The whole process, from impact to final crater formation, was over in less than 15 minutes. 15 minutes. And in those 15 minutes, the world changed forever. But the immediate impact was only the beginning. In some ways, it was the least of what followed. The ejector, all the vaporized and melted rock that had been flung into the upper atmosphere by the impact, began to travel. Tiny glass beads the size of sand grains solidified from the cooling melt as they rose above the atmosphere and rained back down across the entire planet over the following hours. This is called ejecta, and the ejecta layer from Chicxulub has been found in rock formations on every continent and in ocean sediment cores from every ocean basin. A thin, dark layer, rich in the element iridium, which is rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids. Geologists call it the KPG boundary, the line in the rock between before and after. I have been near samples of it, in museums, under glass. It looks like nothing. A thin grey smear in a pale grey rock face. And I have stood in front of it thinking about the hadrosaur at the water, and the small mammal in its burrow, and the tyrannosaur crossing the river, and the Quetzalcoatlus settling for the night on its coastal cliff. All of them were on one side of that smear. Everything that followed was on the other. But let me stay with the physics a little longer, because the physics determines who survived and who did not. In the first hours after the impact, as the ejector rained back down through the atmosphere, something happened that was perhaps even more directly deadly than the impact itself. Each tiny glass bead, encountering atmospheric resistance as it fell, generated heat through friction, individually negligible. But billions upon billions of them falling simultaneously across the entire planet created a pulse of infrared radiation at the surface. Radiant heat, coming from above, coming from every direction in the sky, for a period of perhaps 20 to 40 minutes. The sky glowed, not with fire exactly, with heat. Intense, directional, oven-like heat radiating downward from the atmosphere. And this heat pulse was global. It reached every continent, every hemisphere, the Americas and Europe and Africa and Asia and Australia. Everywhere in the world where the sky was visible, the sky became a source of lethal heat. The large animals on the surface, the ones that could not shelter, the ones that could not burrow underground or submerge in deep water fast enough, were killed by this heat pulse. Not burned exactly, not like a house fire, but thermally stressed past the point of survival. Their internal temperatures rose beyond what their physiology could cope with. They died in the hours after the impact on every continent, across every ecosystem. The wildfires came next. The dry vegetation, already killed by the heat pulse, began to burn. The fires spread across entire continents. In North America, in what is now North Africa, in what is now Asia, the charred remains of ancient forests became fuel for fires that burned for months. The smoke from those fires rose into the upper atmosphere and joined the sulfuric acid aerosols produced by the vaporized carbonate rock of the impact site, and together they began to build a global veil, the earthquakes. The seismic energy released by the impact was the largest in Earth's history, registering somewhere between a magnitude 10 and a magnitude 11. To give you a sense of what that means, the 2011 Tohoku earthquake that devastated northeastern Japan and triggered the Fukushima nuclear disaster was a magnitude 9. The Chicxulub impact seismic event was roughly 30 times more energetic. It triggered tsunamis in every ocean basin. In the Gulf of Mexico, the tsunami waves may have been hundreds of meters high. The continental interiors felt the ground shake for hours. All of this in the space of a day. I want you to breathe slowly again. I know this is a lot. I know the scale of it is difficult to hold. Let your breathing steady. You are safe and you are here and you are far away from all of it, separated from it by 66 million years of time. The animals that survived the first hours, the first terrible day, survived not because they were stronger or faster, or in any obvious way more capable than those that did not. They survived because of where they happened to be at the moment the sky changed. The small mammal in its burrow underground, pressed against the cool earth, was insulated from the heat pulse by the soil above it. The turtle in the deep mud of the river bottom, submerged and cold-blooded and capable of surviving on minimal oxygen, was protected by the water above it. The small lizard under a rock face or wedged into a crevice in a cliff sheltered by stone. The crocodilian in the deepest part of the waterway, largely aquatic, capable of slowing its metabolism to near standstill, waiting in the dark water. The birds, some of them, in the thickest forest cover, beneath canopies of ancient trees that provided some thermal buffering against the heat from above. These were the survivors of the first hours, and size, which had been one of the great advantages of the Mesozoic world, which had allowed the dinosaurs to dominate every terrestrial ecosystem for 160 million years, became the thing that killed them. Being large meant being exposed. Being exposed meant the heat pulse reached you before you could find shelter. Being hit by the heat pulse meant dying in the first hours or days after the impact. The small things hid in the cracks of the world. And the world cracked. And they were in the cracks. And they waited. And then they survived. I find It's profoundly moving, if I am honest with you. There is something almost poetically just about it. The meek inheriting the earth, not because they were better or stronger or more deserving, but because they were small enough to hide in the earth when the sky fell. Because 150 million years of being marginal, of being nocturnal, of being small, of being underground, had accidentally and unknowingly equipped them for this precise catastrophe. But I want to be clear, this was not comfortable survival. This was not a lucky escape followed by a gentle transition to a better world. What followed the first hours was, in its own way, almost worse than the impact itself, and it lasted for years. The fires burned for months, not continuously in every location. That is a misunderstanding. But across the planet, in waves and patches and shifting fronts, fueled by the dried and dead organic material that the heat pulse had killed in the first days, the smoke from those fires rose into the upper atmosphere and joined the sulfur dioxide and sulfuric acid aerosols from the vaporized rock of the impact site. And together they began to do something that dwarfed even the immediate devastation of the impact. They blocked the sun. Not entirely, not completely dark, but enough. Enough to prevent adequate photosynthesis across most of the planet. Enough to drop surface temperatures by 10, 15, in some regions perhaps 20 degrees Celsius below their pre-impact baseline. Enough to turn a warm, tropical, lush world into something cold and dim and struggling. This is the mechanism that most paleontologists now believe was the primary driver of the Great Extinction. Not the impact itself, as terrible as it was, not the immediate heat pulse and wildfires and tsunamis, but the prolonged and global cooling that followed, the impact winter, caused by particulates in the upper atmosphere preventing sunlight from reaching the surface. It lasted years. Some estimates say 2 years before meaningful recovery began, some say 5. The most recent climate modelling, using what we know about the composition of the ejected material and the rate at which it would have been removed from the atmosphere, suggests the most severe effects persisted for at least a decade, with meaningful climate disruption lasting considerably longer. Let me describe what that world felt like in those first terrible years. The sky, which had always been the sky, blue and immense and warm and life-giving, was wrong. During the day, enough light filtered through the haze to see by, but the quality of that light had changed completely. It was dimmer, colder, more diffuse. The shadows at noon were as deep as the shadows of late afternoon. The warmth that had characterized the late Cretaceous world, that rich and wet and tropical warmth that had supported such extraordinary diversity, was gone. The world grew cold. The temperatures at the surface dropped dramatically. Not uniformly, not identically everywhere. But globally, the mean surface temperature fell by perhaps 10 to 15 degrees Celsius in the period immediately after the impact. In some regions, the drop was sharper. In high latitudes, winter temperatures that had previously been mild by geological standards became genuinely frigid in ways that the organisms of the late Cretaceous world had simply never needed to adapt to. And then the plants died. This is the part of the story that does not receive enough attention when we talk about the KPG extinction. We talk about the dinosaurs dying, and they did, catastrophically. But the primary ecological collapse was botanical. It was plant death, on a global scale, that drove everything else. It was the collapse of photosynthesis across the entire terrestrial surface of the planet that pulled the food web apart from the bottom up. Photosynthesis requires light. It is, in the simplest possible terms, the conversion of light energy into chemical energy stored in sugar molecules. Without adequate sunlight, without the energy input that photosynthesis captures and fixes into the organic matter that all other life depends on, the entire food web begins to collapse. Plants that had survived the initial heat pulse, that had weathered the first terrible hours in the form of root systems or seeds or underground bulbs or in the deep shade of thick canopy, emerged into a world that could not support their growth. The light was wrong. The temperature was wrong. The chemistry of the soil, disrupted by acid rain and ash deposition, was wrong. The forests did not burn and then regrow. They burned, and the light that should have fueled regrowth was simply not there. The world became, in large areas, a landscape of charred stumps and cooling ash in which nothing green could take hold. For the herbivores, the hadrosaurs and the ceratopsians and the ankylosaurs and the sauropods still clinging on in other parts of the world, this was the fatal blow. Even those animals that had somehow survived the heat pulse and the wildfires and the earthquakes and the tsunamis now found themselves in a world with nothing to eat. A world with no food. A world where the entire foundation of the food web had been removed. A hadrosaur needs tremendous quantities of vegetation every single day to sustain its metabolism. A large adult Edmontosaurus, perhaps 10 meters long and 4 tons in weight, would need to consume hundreds of kilograms of plant material daily. In a world where the plant material simply did not exist, in a world where the forests were charred ash, and the meadows were dead and brown, and the ferns would not come back for decades, an Edmontosaurus was just an animal waiting to starve, with nothing to do but walk further and further in search of food that was not there, and it starved. They all starved. The herbivores died in waves, over weeks and months, their populations collapsing one by one across the continents as the food ran out. The last holdouts were perhaps those in the richest and most sheltered environments, the deepest valleys, the most protected canyons, where some residual vegetation clung on longest. But eventually even those refugees were exhausted, and as the herbivores died, the carnivores that depended on them followed, not immediately. Scavenging is a form of adaptation, and the immediate post-impact landscape provided an extraordinary abundance of carcasses. A tyrannosaur in the months immediately following the impact may actually have found more food, not less, as the bodies of herbivores accumulated across the landscape. But there is only so long you can live off carcasses. Eventually they are consumed or rot, and when the last carcasses were gone, when there was nothing left to scavenge, the great predators had nothing. I think about the last tyrannosaur, in those quiet late-night moments when the mind moves freely through dark territory. An animal that had no concept of what had happened, that had no framework for understanding that the world it had been born into had changed irrevocably and permanently, just moving through a dead landscape smelling for prey, looking for the world it knew, and not finding it. Just a very large and very hungry animal walking through ash. The last tyrannosaur probably died within a few months of the impact, not dramatically, not in a final great battle, just stopped moving one day, in a cold grey landscape far from the inland sea and the green forests that no longer existed. I find this genuinely heartbreaking if I let myself sit with it. Not because the tyrannosaur was more important than any other living thing, it was not, but because of the completeness of its unknowing. It died without understanding what had ended it, without any framework for grief or loss or meaning. It just kept walking, kept looking, kept being the thing it had evolved to be, in a world that no longer had room for it, and then it stopped. But not everything stopped. And this is where the story of the extinction becomes gradually something else entirely, something different, something that, if you are willing to follow it far enough, becomes genuinely astonishing. Come underground with me, not deep underground, just a meter or two down, into the kind of shallow burrow that a small, warm-blooded, insectivorous mammal might dig for itself in the soft soil beneath the roots of a late Cretaceous conifer. It is warm down here despite everything. The thermal mass of the surrounding earth insulates the burrow from the catastrophic events unfolding on the surface above. It smells of old roots and damp clay, and the faint musk of the creature that dug it. It is dark and close and quiet. This is where the future is hiding. Mammals had existed alongside the dinosaurs for over 150 million years, and for most of that immense stretch of time, they had been, to put it simply, not particularly impressive, small, mostly nocturnal, mostly insectivorous or omnivorous, occupying the ecological niches that the dinosaurs had no interest in, the cracks and margins of the Mesozoic world. They were not players at the centre of the story, they were witnesses, survivors at the edges, watching from the undergrowth and the leaf litter while the great story of the Mesozoic unfolded above them. There had been some experimentation with larger body sizes in earlier periods. Some early mammal lineages had explored forms that pushed toward cat size or even larger, but these tended not to persist long or to diversify widely. The dinosaurs occupied the large animal ecological roles so completely, so successfully, that there was simply no room for expansion into them. Every time a mammal lineage tried to grow larger, to become a significant predator or a significant herbivore, it bumped up against the ceiling of competition with organisms that had been optimized for those roles for tens of millions of years. So the mammals stayed small, they stayed nocturnal, They stayed underground or in the undergrowth. They stayed in the margins. And in doing so, over 150 million years of marginality, they evolved a set of characteristics that turned out, completely by accident, with no foresight and no planning, and no awareness of what was coming, to be precisely suited to surviving the worst catastrophe in the last quarter of 1 billion years of Earth history. They were warm-blooded. They could maintain their body temperature independently of the environment around them. This was crucial when that environment suddenly became very cold. They were small. They needed much less food to survive than any large animal. A creature that weighs 20 grams can subsist on what would not even register as a meal for an animal weighing a ton. This was crucial when food was suddenly very scarce. They had generalist diets. They could eat insects, seeds, roots, fungus, worms, dead organic matter, essentially anything they could find. They were not specialists locked into depending on a single food source that might suddenly disappear. This was crucial in a world where most specific food sources had suddenly disappeared. They reproduced quickly, short gestation periods, multiple offspring per litter, rapid maturation. This meant that a population devastated by catastrophe could rebuild itself relatively quickly, in years rather than decades. This was crucial in a world where populations were being destroyed constantly, and they could burrow or find existing burrows, or squeeze into tiny spaces under rocks and roots and in cliff faces. They could get underground, get small, get invisible, get out of the immediate path of danger. Every single one of these traits developed over millions of years of being the small, overlooked, not particularly impressive thing living in the shadow of the dinosaurs. Every single one of these traits became, in the aftermath of the KPG impact, a survival advantage of the highest possible order. This is one of those facts that genuinely stops me when I think about it too carefully. The mammals did not survive because they were better. They survived because they were different, because the same conditions that had kept them small and marginal and underground for 150 million years had accidentally, without intention or foresight, been crafting perfect extinction survivors. The asteroid did not just end the non-avian dinosaurs, it promoted the mammals, and the mammals did not waste their opportunity. In the earliest Paleocene, the geological period that begins immediately after the KPG boundary, the fossil record shows a rapid, almost explosive diversification of mammalian life. Within the first few 100,000 years after the impact, mammals were already beginning to fill the ecological roles vacated by the disappearance of the non-avian dinosaurs. Within a few million years, they had diversified into forms ranging from tiny shrew-like insectivores to animals approaching the size of a modern rhinoceros. The pace of this diversification is, by geological standards, extraordinary. Normally, diversification of this scale takes tens of millions of years. Evolutionary radiation from a small founding population into a wide range of ecological forms typically unfolds across geological timescales that make even the dinosaur story seem brief. But the mammals did it in what amounts to a geological eye blink, because the ecological space was wide open, the evolutionary pressure was intense and immediate, and they were, in some deep sense, ready, even if they had no idea they were ready. But the mammals were not the only survivors, and this is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary. Let me tell you about the birds. I want to tell you something that I think most people know intellectually, but have not quite let themselves feel. There is a Tyrannosaurus Rex outside your window right now, perhaps several. They are probably there most mornings. You almost certainly hear them calling to each other, especially in the spring. They are smaller than you are imagining. They have feathers. They weigh somewhere between 12 grams and 12 kilograms, depending on the species. We call them birds. But birds are, in the most technically accurate sense of the phrase, living dinosaurs, not descended from dinosaurs, not related to dinosaurs, not the evolutionary cousins of dinosaurs. They are dinosaurs. They belong to the dinosaur lineage just as completely and unambiguously as Triceratops or Stegosaurus or Tyrannosaurus itself. They are avian dinosaurs, a clade within the broader dinosaur family tree that arose from a group of small, feathered, bipedal theropods during the Jurassic period, and that has never gone extinct. When we say the dinosaurs went extinct 66 million years ago, we are being imprecise. What we mean is that the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct, the dinosaurs that lacked the specific combination of traits that would be inherited and elaborated into modern birds. The large dinosaurs, and the medium-sized dinosaurs, and most of the small dinosaurs. Yes, those went extinct. But the avian dinosaurs, the birds, did not go extinct. They survived, and then they thrived. The story of how they survived is fascinating and important, because not all birds made it through the KPG extinction. The event was catastrophic for the birds too. Of the many lineages of early birds that existed in the late Cretaceous, most were wiped out. The enantiornithines, the most diverse and abundant of the Cretaceous bird groups, were completely eliminated. The hesperornithiforms, the great diving birds of the inland sea, were gone. Many other early bird lineages vanished. What survived, once again, were the generalists, the ground-foraging birds, the seed-eaters, the birds that had the metabolic flexibility and the dietary breadth to subsist on whatever could be found in a post-impact world, seeds and insects and organic detritus, rather than depending on living trees or living fish, or specific forest environments that no longer existed. The earliest Paleocene bird fauna was impoverished compared to what had come before, a stripped-down, reduced set of lineages picking their way through a damaged world. But they were alive, and they reproduced, and as the world slowly recovered, as the plant communities rebuilt, and the insect diversity returned and the forests grew back, the birds diversified. Today, there are approximately 10,000 species of living birds. They inhabit every continent, including Antarctica. They range from hummingbirds weighing less than 2 grams to ostriches weighing over 100 kilograms. They fill ecological roles from deep-sea diving to high-altitude soaring, to nectarivory to large animal predation to aquatic filter feeding. They are, by many measures, one of the most spectacularly successful vertebrate groups in the history of life on Earth. All of them descended from the small number of bird lineages that made it through this KPG bottleneck. All of them carry in their genes the legacy of what their ancestors survived. When a bird sings outside your window in the morning, it is a dinosaur singing. When a hawk rides a thermal in the afternoon sky, it is a dinosaur riding that thermal. When a penguin porpoises through cold Antarctic water, it is a dinosaur in the water. The lineage that began perhaps 230 million years ago, that gave us the sauropods and the ornithopods and the ceratopsians and the tyrannosaurs and the swift-feathered predators of the Cretaceous, that lineage is still here. It just looks different. And I think this is one of the most profound things about the KPG story. The extinction event did not end the dinosaurs. It transformed them. It killed most of them. Yes, it killed the large forms and the medium-sized forms and most of the small forms. But the particular combination of traits that characterized the avian branch of the dinosaur tree turned out to be, again and again, traits that conferred survivability. Small body, high metabolism, warm-blooded, capable of flight or at least gliding, seed-eating capability, rapid reproduction. The birds that had these traits in the right combination made it through, and 10,000 species later, here they are. Here we are, surrounded by them. The dinosaurs never left. They just got smaller and got feathers and learned to sing. Let me take you to the ocean now. The post-impact ocean is a very different place from the one that existed before. If you were standing on a shoreline in the earliest Paleocene looking out over the water, you would be looking at something impoverished, damaged. The warm, diverse, extraordinarily complex marine ecosystems of the late Cretaceous had been devastated, and the damage showed in the strange, quiet quality of the water. The mass extinction at the KPG boundary was not just a terrestrial event. In the oceans, in some ways, it was even more severe. The ammonites were gone. These extraordinary animals, with their beautiful spiral shells, had been one of the most diverse and successful groups of marine organisms for over 300 million years. They had survived the Endordovician extinction. They had survived the End-Devonian extinction. They had survived the Great Dying, the End-Permian extinction that nearly sterilized the entire planet. They had diversified and contracted and diversified again across geological time in a way that spoke to profound resilience. Their fossil record is one of the richest and most detailed of any animal group, and then, at the KPG boundary, they vanished. Not reduced, not diminished, gone. Every species, every lineage, 300 million years of history, erased. I find this staggering to contemplate. The ammonites had survived so much. They had been through fire and ice and anoxia and acidification and had always come back, and this time they did not. The combination of the impact effects with the specific vulnerability of calcifying marine organisms to ocean acidification was something they could not survive. The mosasaurs were gone too. Those extraordinary marine reptiles that had dominated the open ocean ecosystems of the Cretaceous, with their double-hinged jaws and their streamlined bodies, and their fluid, serpentine swimming, were simply gone. Not a single species survived. The plesiosaurs, already declining through the Cretaceous but still present, were gone, and the microscopic organisms at the base of the marine food web, the foraminifera and coccolithophores and other plankton that formed the foundation of ocean ecosystems, experienced a near-total collapse. Their populations crashed to perhaps 5% of their pre-impact levels. The entire marine food web built on the productivity of these tiny photosynthesizing and heterotrophic organisms lost its foundation. But the ocean did not die. This bears repeating. The ocean did not die. In the deep water, where light had never penetrated even in the best of times, communities built around chemosynthesis rather than photosynthesis continued largely undisturbed. The hydrothermal vent ecosystems, where organisms derive energy from the chemistry of the venting water rather than from sunlight, were barely touched by events at the surface. And the sharks survived. I want to stay on this for a moment because it is extraordinary. Sharks had already survived 4 previous mass extinctions by the time the Chicxulub impactor arrived. The End-Ordovician, the End-Devonian, the End-Permian, the End-Triassic. 4 near endings of complex life on Earth, and the sharks had come through every one of them. They had been refining their basic body plan for 400 million years when the KPG event occurred, and they survived it too, not unscathed. Some shark lineages were lost. Some groups that had diversified in the Cretaceous did not make it through. But the fundamental shark plan, the cartilaginous skeleton, and the multiple rows of replaceable teeth, and the sensory systems that can detect electrical fields and pressure waves through water, that plan had proven itself over 400 million years of aquatic predation. It survived. The crocodilians survived. Semi-aquatic, with the ability to fast for extended periods, capable of remaining submerged for long periods, with generalist diets that could include fish, carrion, invertebrates, and whatever else presented itself. The crocodilians made it through the KPG bottleneck. They are still here, almost unchanged from their Cretaceous ancestors, the most ancient lineage of archosaurs, the group that also includes the dinosaurs and the birds. When you see a crocodile lying in the sun beside a river, you are looking at an animal whose basic body plan has been tested across multiple mass extinctions and found adequate. Found more than adequate. Found essentially optimal for a certain kind of semi-aquatic ambush predation in warm water environments. The crocodiles are not primitive. They are profoundly, elegantly refined. And the bony fish. The ray-finned fishes took enormous losses at the KPG boundary, but they survived and eventually recovered to become the most species-rich vertebrate group in history. More than 30,000 species of ray-finned fish alive today, from the deep ocean to high mountain streams, from tropical reefs to Arctic waters. The post-impact ocean, slowly recovering over hundreds of thousands of years, was rebuilt largely around fish. New food webs, new ecological relationships, new diversity built on the ancient foundations of fish diversity that had survived. The pattern is the same in the ocean as on land. What survived tended to be what was small, or generalist, or buffered from the primary kill mechanisms by environment or physiology. Deep water organisms insulated from the surface. Organisms with metabolic flexibility that could handle radical environmental change. Organisms with broad dietary tolerance that were not locked into specific food sources. The extinction was a filter, a catastrophic, global, comprehensive filter, and what it filtered for were precisely the characteristics that would build the modern world. A kind reminder to not forget to subscribe to keep the channel alive. The recovery from the KPG extinction was not quick. I want to be clear about this, because the narrative temptation is to skip over the long, slow, grinding work of ecological recovery and jump straight to the eventual flourishing of the new world. But the recovery matters. The long duration of it matters. The difficulty of it matters. Because it was precisely that slow, difficult, repeatedly interrupted process of recovery that shaped everything that came after. In the first months and years after. The impact. The world was not recovering. It was dying, Every day, more animals were dying, more populations were going below the threshold for viability, more lineages were going extinct quietly, the last individuals of their kind dying without anyone to record it, without any marker in the rock except the absence of their fossils above the KPG boundary. The first signs of plant recovery came from the ferns. Ferns are almost always the first plants to recolonize devastated landscapes. They have been doing this for hundreds of millions of years. They are the pioneer species of the plant world, spore-dispersing, stress-tolerant, capable of establishing themselves on bare substrate in low-light conditions. And in the fossil record of the early Paleocene, immediately above the KPG boundary, there is a clear and distinctive signature called the fern spike, a sudden, dramatic increase in fern spores. The first green thing in a brown and ashen world, ferns, small and quiet and ancient, unfurling their fronds in the dim cold light of the post-impact sky. And then, slowly, over thousands of years, the other plants followed. Flowering plants, which had been so important and so diverse in the late Cretaceous, began their recovery. They were aided by their evolutionary flexibility. Angiosperms have a remarkable range of reproductive strategies, from large fleshy fruits to tiny windborne seeds to underground bulbs and rhizomes that could survive the impact winter dormant and then resprout when conditions improved. Within a few million years of the KPG boundary, flowering plant diversity had returned to something approaching pre-impact levels. And as the plants recovered, the animals that depended on plants recovered too. The small mammals came out of their burrows into a world that was at first still cold and dim and depleted, but marginally better than the day before, and then better again. And then again. Each season of recovery, each expansion of the recovering. Plant communities, each return of insect diversity that always follows plant diversity. The mammals found more food and more opportunity and more ecological space. The pace of mammalian diversification in the early Paleocene is one of the most dramatic evolutionary radiations in the fossil record. Within the first 10 million years after the KPG boundary, the Paleocene and early Eocene, mammals had diversified into an extraordinary range of body sizes and ecological forms. There were the condylarths, the early ungulates that would eventually give rise to horses and cows and deer and pigs, and the entire diverse world of hoofed mammals. There were the creodonts, the early carnivorans, the forerunners of modern cats and dogs and bears and seals. There were early primates appearing in the fossil record by about 60 million years ago, small arboreal creatures with grasping hands and forward-facing eyes, living in the recovering tropical forests of what is now North America and Europe. Early primates in North America, in Europe. Think about what that means. In the early Paleocene and Eocene, the world's geography was different enough from today that primates, which today are restricted largely to tropical Africa, Asia and South America, were thriving in what is now Montana. The world was warmer, the forests were more extensive. The evolutionary experiment that would eventually produce us was running on every habitable continent, and the whales. The early whales, the archaeocetes, were beginning their transition from land to sea during this period. Their ancestors were semi-aquatic land mammals, something like a small hippo-like creature that began spending more and more time in the water, eating fish, and whose descendants over 50 million years became the most massive animals in the history of life on Earth. The blue whale, which can reach 30 meters in length and 150 tons in weight, is the direct descendant of a small land mammal that survived the KPG extinction in a burrow. There is something almost vertiginous about this trajectory. From 20 grams of warm-blooded furtiveness in a late Cretaceous burrow to 150 tons of blue whale in the open ocean, from the leaf litter to the abyssal deep. The KPG extinction did not just allow the mammals to survive, it gave them the world, it gave them everything. Every ecological role the dinosaurs had vacated, every habitat the marine reptiles had occupied, every niche the flying reptiles had filled, the whole world opened up and the mammals and the birds walked into it. It took time, it took millions of years. The early Paleocene world was impoverished and strange, the ecological communities simple and unstructured compared to what had come before. But time was one thing the Earth had in abundance, and life, it turned out, had plans. Now let us enter the territory of genuine scientific uncertainty, because everything I have told you so far, the broad strokes of the story, the impact and the winter, and the extinctions and the survivors and the recovery, that is the scientific consensus. That is the version of events that the weight of evidence supports and that most researchers in the relevant fields broadly agree on. But within that story, there are questions that remain actively contested. Questions that paleontologists and geochemists and evolutionary biologists argue about with genuine intensity. And I want to take you into those debates, not because I have answers, but because the questions themselves are fascinating, and because I think that sitting with real uncertainty, with questions that are genuinely unresolved, is a more honest and ultimately more interesting experience than sitting with false certainty. The first debate is the volcano question. At roughly the same time as the Chicxulub impact, give or take a few 100,000 years, something else was happening on the other side of the planet that in almost any other context would itself be considered one of the most catastrophic events in Earth history. The Deccan Traps were erupting. The Deccan Traps are a massive volcanic province in what is now central and western India, covering an area of roughly 500,000 square kilometres. They were formed by one of the largest volcanic events of the past 250 million years. Over the course of approximately 1 million years spanning the KP boundary, an extraordinary volume of flood basalt lava, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million cubic kilometres of it, poured out across the Indian subcontinent. To give you a sense of the scale, this is enough lava to cover the entire continental United States to a depth of several hundred metres, and the Deccan eruptions released vast quantities of sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Not in a single catastrophic burst, as the Chicxulub impact did, but slowly, continuously, over hundreds of thousands of years. Here is the debate. How much of the KPG mass extinction was caused by the asteroid impact, and how much was caused by the Deccan volcanism? For decades after the discovery of the KPG iridium layer by Luis and Walter Alvarez in 1980, the scientific consensus was clear and relatively simple. It was the asteroid. The impact winter caused the plant die-off. The plant die-off caused the food web collapse. The food web collapse caused the extinction. But more recent work has complicated this significantly. The Deccan eruptions were massive enough, and their effects on global climate were substantial enough, that many researchers now believe the world of the late Cretaceous was already under significant stress before the asteroid arrived. The eruptions had been going on for hundreds of thousands of years before the impact, slowly warming the climate through greenhouse gas emissions, subtly altering ocean chemistry, putting pressure on ecosystems that were already adapting to change. Some paleontological evidence suggests that certain animal groups were already showing signs of decline before the KPG boundary. If this is true, it means the asteroid did not fall on a stable and flourishing world. It fell on a world that was already showing cracks. And then there is the genuinely extraordinary hypothesis that a small number of researchers have proposed, that the Chicxulub impact may itself have triggered or intensified the Deccan eruptions. The mechanism would be seismic. The enormous seismic energy released by the impact, travelling through the body of the Earth, could potentially have destabilised the magma systems already active beneath what is now India. There is suggestive timing evidence. The most intense phase of the Deccan eruptions appears to correspond with a period shortly after the Chicxulub impact. The correlation is not perfect, and the causation is deeply debated, but the possibility exists, an asteroid hitting Mexico and triggering a volcanic eruption in India. The Earth is a connected system in ways that can be genuinely difficult to internalise. The second debate concerns the pattern of the extinction itself. The standard narrative is that the extinction was sudden, geologically instantaneous. The KPG boundary is sharp. On one side, dinosaur fossils. On the other side, no dinosaur fossils. The change is measured in centimetres of rock, which translates to thousands of years at most, perhaps much less. But some researchers examining the most detailed fossil records available have found suggestions that certain dinosaur groups were already declining in diversity before the impact. Fewer new species appearing, more species going extinct without replacement. A gradual reduction in the evenness and richness of dinosaur communities in the millions of years leading up to the boundary. Was the extinction sudden, or was it the final blow to a world already weakened? The honest answer is probably both, depending on where you look and which groups you study. The world of the latest Cretaceous was a complex and heterogeneous place. Some regions may have been thriving right up to the boundary. Others may have already been under stress. The asteroid fell on a mosaic world, and the extinction it triggered was probably mosaic too, with some groups and some regions hit harder and faster than others. The third debate is about chance. I have told you that the survivors of the KPG extinction tended to share certain characteristics: small, generalist, burrowing, aquatic, capable of handling stress. And that is true as a pattern. But patterns in biology are never perfect. There were exceptions. Large-bodied birds survived. Some lineages of insects and plants that should have been vulnerable did not go extinct. Some lineages that seemed well-positioned did. Some researchers have argued that chance, pure geographical and temporal luck, played a significant role. Being in the right place, on the right day. A burrow in one location survived because the fire went east rather than west. A lineage of birds survived because the patch of forest they happened to be in provided just enough thermal buffering. An identical lineage in an adjacent region did not, for no adaptive reason, just because of where they happened to be. If this is true, and I believe it probably is at least in part, then the modern world is not simply the product of the superiority of mammals and birds over non-avian dinosaurs. It is the product of adaptive advantages combined with the most extraordinary and unrepeatable luck. The mammals that gave rise to us survived not just because they were well adapted. They survived because they were in the right burrow, in the right valley, on the right side of the right hill on the day the sky fell, and on some other version of Earth, in some parallel history, different survivors emerged. Different organisms made it through the cracks, and 66 million years later, that world would be unrecognizable. We are the children of a lucky catastrophe. I find this both humbling and strangely beautiful. There is nothing inevitable about us. There is nothing predetermined about the modern world. It is a contingent thing, a magnificent, improbable, unrepeatable accident, a particular throw of the cosmic dice that landed this way rather than that way, and here we are, the result of it, trying to understand it. Let me step further back now, further than we have been. I want to give you the geological long view, because there is a pattern in Earth history that becomes visible only when you look at very long timescales, and this pattern changes the meaning of the KPG extinction, and of extinction in general, in ways that I think are important and worth sitting with. The KPG event is the most famous mass extinction in the public imagination, but it was not the largest, it was not the most severe, it was not even the most recent by geological standards. There have been 5 mass extinctions in the history of complex animal life on Earth. 5 events in which a significant fraction, in some cases the vast majority, of all species on the planet went extinct in a geologically brief interval of time. Paleontologists call them the Big Five. The first was the late Ordovician extinction, approximately 440 million years ago. Complex animal life at this point was almost entirely marine, and this extinction killed roughly 85% of all marine species. The cause was a combination of glaciation and the massive sea level changes that came with it. The world was a very different place, and the kill mechanism was ice and cold and falling seas. The second was the late Devonian extinction, approximately 375 million years ago, also primarily marine, also catastrophic. About 75% of all species were lost. The causes are still debated, involving possible asteroid impacts, volcanic activity, ocean anoxia, and climate shifts driven by the expansion of land plants, which were just beginning their colonization of the terrestrial world during this period. The third was the Permian-Triassic extinction, the Great Dying, approximately 252 million years ago. This is the most severe mass extinction in the entire history of complex animal life. Approximately 96% of all marine species and 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species went extinct. The oceans were largely sterilized. The continents were left almost bare. Life on Earth came closer to complete elimination during the Great Dying than at any other point in the past 500 million years. It was caused primarily by the Siberian Traps eruptions, an even larger volcanic event than the Deccan Traps, releasing carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide over a period of perhaps 1 million years, triggering a cascade of environmental effects including global warming, ocean acidification, and widespread anoxia in the ocean depths. The world nearly ended, and then it did not, and the Triassic period that followed, building on the tiny handful of survivors that made it through, gave us the first dinosaurs and the first mammals and the first true flying vertebrates, the pterosaurs. The world that emerged from the Great Dying was as different from the world before it as the world after the KPG was from the world before it. The fourth extinction was the End-Triassic event, approximately 201 million years ago. Caused by the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, another enormous volcanic episode triggered by the opening of the Atlantic Ocean as the supercontinent Pangaea began to break apart. About 75% of all species went extinct. This extinction cleared the way for the dinosaurs to achieve the ecological dominance of the Jurassic world. The dinosaurs were not the survivors of the KPG extinction who then rose to dominance. They were the survivors and beneficiaries of the End-Triassic extinction, the catastrophe that gave them their world, and then, 135 million years later, their descendants became the survivors of the KPG extinction. Catastrophe giving way to recovery, giving way to a new world, which in turn builds up and diversifies and reaches extraordinary complexity, and then faces catastrophe again. This is the deep pattern. 5 mass extinctions, each one catastrophic, each one apparently terminal, and after each one recovery, not restoration of what was lost, not a return to what had been, but something new, something built from the survivors, something unexpected, something that could not have been predicted from the world that preceded the catastrophe. After the late Ordovician extinction, the recovery produced the Silurian and Devonian worlds, with their extraordinary diversity of fish and the first tentative colonization of the land. After the late Devonian extinction, the recovery produced the forests of the Carboniferous and the first truly terrestrial vertebrates. After the Great Dying, the recovery produced the Triassic world and the dinosaurs and the mammals. After the End-Triassic extinction, the recovery produced the Jurassic world, the great age of the sauropods and the sea monsters and the first birds. After the KPG extinction, the recovery produced us. We are the recovery from the 5th mass extinction. We are what emerged from the survivors of the last catastrophe. Every human being alive, every mammal, every bird is the product of a recovery from near-total planetary devastation. I find something genuinely profound in this. Not comforting exactly, but profound. Life on Earth has been nearly extinguished 5 times, and 5 times it found the cracks and the margins and the deep water and the underground, and came back out into the light. Not in the same form, not with the same organisms, not to the same world, but the persistence of it, the creativity of it, the way life keeps finding new forms and new strategies and new ways to exist in a changing world, is almost impossible to contemplate without feeling something. The extinction event that may not have ended life, because none of the extinction events ended life. They ended versions of life, particular expressions of the possibilities of biology at particular moments in geological time, and then new possibilities emerged from the ruins. This is not a comfortable fact, given everything happening in the world right now, but it is a fact, and I think it matters. I need to ask you something as we approach the end of our journey together. Where do you fit in this story? Because you do fit. You are not outside it, watching it as history. You are inside it, as a continuation of it. As the latest chapter in a story that began 3.5 billion years ago, and that has not ended, you are, in the most direct sense possible, the product of the KP extinction event. If the Chicxulub impactor had not arrived 66 million years ago, or if it had arrived just slightly differently, and the outcome had been less severe, the small insectivorous mammals that hid in the earth while the sky fell would never have had the evolutionary opportunity to diversify into the extraordinary range of forms that eventually, over 66 million years of ongoing evolution, produced the primates, the great apes, the hominins, and eventually you. The conditions that produced us were created by catastrophe, the specific combination of events that cleared the ecological space for mammalian radiation, that freed the mammals from the constraints imposed by dinosaur dominance, was the most violent event on Earth in the past 250 million years. We exist because a rock fell. This is not a comfortable thought, exactly. Or maybe it is. I am not sure. I keep turning it over and finding different things in it, depending on the angle. On one hand, it suggests the contingency and improbability of us. We're not inevitable. We're not the destined endpoint of some progressive trend in evolution. We're one particular outcome of a particular set of contingent events, one throw of a very complicated set of dice. If anything had been slightly different, if the asteroid had been slightly smaller or slightly larger, if it had arrived slightly earlier or slightly later, if it had hit a different kind of rock and released different amounts of different compounds into the atmosphere, the KPG extinction might have been less severe, or more severe, or different in its pattern, and any of those differences might have changed which survivors made it through. On the other hand, the very improbability of us is part of what makes us extraordinary. We are not the inevitable product of a universe that tends toward intelligence. We are a particular, unlikely, unrepeatable thing, a specific combination of evolutionary history and contingent survival, and accumulated adaptation that has never existed before and will never exist again in exactly this form. We are 66 million years of post-catastrophe evolution, standing upright in the light, and we are, perhaps uniquely in the history of life on Earth, capable of understanding what we are, capable of looking back at the 5 mass extinctions and understanding the pattern, capable of reading the KPG boundary in the rock and understanding what it means, capable of standing in front of a museum display case with a piece of iridium-rich clay and feeling something about what it represents. No other species in the history of life on Earth, as far as we know, has been capable of this. The hadrosaurs did not understand the world they lived in. The tyrannosaurs did not understand what was ending them. The small mammals in their burrows did not understand that they were about to inherit the world. We understand, or at least we are trying, too, and understanding carries responsibility. Because many scientists are now arguing that we are living inside the beginning of the 6th mass extinction. The current rate of species loss across vertebrate groups, amphibians and mammals and birds and reptiles and fish exceeds background extinction rates by orders of magnitude. Habitat destruction, climate change, pollution, invasive species, direct exploitation and hunting. The combined pressure of human activity on the biosphere is producing extinction rates that, if sustained, will result in a loss of biodiversity comparable to the Big Five in geological terms. We are, in this view, not just the product of a mass extinction, we are causing one. I want to be honest about this, even in a quiet late-night conversation about deep time. It seems dishonest not to mention it. It seems wrong to talk about the KPG extinction and its survivors and the beautiful, improbable 66 million year-long story of recovery and diversification without acknowledging what is happening now. But I also want to hold that awareness alongside everything else we have talked about tonight. The full picture is complicated. It is neither entirely dark nor entirely light. Life on Earth has survived 5 mass extinctions. Each time the survivors rebuilt, each time the ecological space created by loss was eventually filled with new diversity, new complexity, new experiments in the possibilities of being alive. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. It will not be finished for another 4 or 5 billion years when the sun expands and consumes it. Whatever we do, whatever we fail to do, life will find the cracks. The pattern of the last 500 million years is clear on this point. The tragedy of a human-caused mass extinction is not that life on Earth will end. It will not. The tragedy is what would be lost. The irreplaceable diversity of the living world we inhabit. The millions of years of evolutionary history embodied in each species that goes extinct. The extraordinary accumulated complexity of the ecosystems that took tens of millions of years to build. And the fact that we are part of that world, part of that complexity, dependent on it in ways we do not fully understand. And the deeper tragedy is this. We are the first species in the history of life on Earth that has the capacity to understand what is happening, to model the consequences, to make different choices, and to act on those choices. No asteroid chose to fall, no volcano chose to erupt, no glacier chose to advance, but we choose. And understanding the deep history of life on this planet, the full scope of what has been lost and what has survived, the extraordinary contingency and stubborn persistence of life across geological time, seems to me like a prerequisite for making those choices with appropriate seriousness. We are a recovery. We emerge from catastrophe. We carry in our bodies the genetic legacy of every extinction and every recovery in the history of complex life. We are made of survivals, made of the contingent luck and the adaptive brilliance of our ancestors, all the way back to the first cells in the first warm ocean, and we can choose what comes next. The question is not whether the Earth will survive. It will. The question is what version of life we want to share it with, what richness we want to preserve, what story we want to be part of. Let me leave you with an image. 66 million years ago, on a night very much like this one, a small creature in a burrow somewhere in the dark pressed itself against the earth and listened to the world change above it. The sky had fallen. The fires were burning. Everything it had ever known about the world was wrong now, and new rules were taking over, and it did not understand any of this and could not. But it stayed alive. It held on, in the dark, against the cold, with nothing to eat and nothing to do but wait. And it survived. And then it came out into a changed world, and its descendants, over 66 million years of living and dying and adapting and diversifying, eventually became you. You are the continuation of an unbroken chain of survival that stretches back through the KPG extinction, and the Great Dying and the Late Devonian catastrophe, and the Late Ordovician glaciation, all the way back to the first cells in the first warm, shallow waters of the young Earth. Billions of years of staying alive. Billions of years of finding the cracks, of waiting out the darkness, of coming back into the light. That is what you are made of. That is who you are. Take a slow breath in and let it out. The night is quiet. Tomorrow will bring a new morning. And somewhere, right now, 10,000 species of birds, the living dinosaurs, the survivors of the great catastrophe 66 million years ago, are roosting in their nests and their trees and their cliff faces and their reed beds all over the world, their small hearts beating in the dark, their feathers warm against the night, waiting as their ancestors waited for the light to come back. There is a cliff face in the Badlands of North Dakota that I want to take you to. You do not need to be fully awake to go there. In fact, I think the half-asleep mind, the mind just beginning to loosen its grip on the ordinary world, is the perfect mind for this kind of place. Because what this cliff face holds requires a softening of the usual categories, a willingness to let time expand and become something other than the thin slice we normally inhabit. The cliff is pale and striped, buff and tan and grey and rust, layers of ancient sediment pressing against each other in horizontal bands. Each band is a chapter. Each band represents thousands of years of accumulated earth and water and the slow compression of time into stone. And somewhere in that cliff, perhaps partway up, there is a thin dark layer, a few centimetres at most, pale grey shading to dark grey shading to iron-stained clay. This is the KPG boundary. This is the line. Geologists come from all over the world to study formations like this one. The Hell Creek Formation of the northern Great Plains is one of the most complete records anywhere on Earth of the transition between the Cretaceous and the Paleocene. Below this line, the rock contains fossils of Triceratops and Edmontosaurus and Tyrannosaurs, and all the magnificent cast of characters we have been talking about tonight. Plant fossils, insect fossils, fish fossils, the record of a world at the height of its powers. Above this line, none of them. Absence, a gap. And then slowly, tentatively, the first signs of a new world beginning to take shape. The rocks do not record the sound of the impact. They do not record the heat pulse or the wildfires or what the world sounded like in the first hours after everything changed. They record only the chemistry, the iridium spike, the shocked quartz, the carbon spherules from the incinerated forests, the sulfur isotopes, the fern spores from the slow recovery. They record what happened in terms of what was left behind, in terms of the traces that time could preserve across 66 million years. And standing at that cliff face, running your fingers across the KPG boundary, you're touching not just a geological time boundary. You're touching 66 million years of compression. All that life, all that complexity, all those daily mornings and evening calls and seasons and migrations, reduced and compressed by time into a smear you could cover with your palm. I find this almost unbearably moving when I let myself sit with it fully. The way that every fossil in that cliff represents not just the organism that died and happened to be preserved, but the countless billions of organisms of the same species that lived and died and left nothing behind, that mattered, and were eaten and fed the next generation, and are completely gone now except that their lineage continued. The KPG boundary tells us what was lost, but it can only hint at the richness of what existed. The full living complexity of the world that thin dark line divides from everything after. Remember this as you settle into the quiet. Everything around you was built one generation at a time, one birth and one death at a time, across 66 million years. The recovery was slow, The building was patient, and you are what it was building toward. There is something I want to tell you about sleep, about the specific quality of sleep in the dark, in a warm and protected space, while something enormous unfolds in the world outside. The small mammals that survived the KPG extinction spent a great deal of their lives in exactly this state. Underground, in burrows, curled against the cold and the dark, their metabolism slowed, their bodies conserving what warmth and energy they had. Above them, the world was transformed. The sky was wrong. The temperature was wrong. The sounds and smells of the world they had been born into were replaced by something cold and silent and alien. But in the burrow it was dark and close and warm, and they survived. I think about this a great deal, about the resilience of small protected things, about the way that some of the most important work of survival happens in stillness, in the slow metabolic work of simply staying alive until conditions outside become survivable again. There is a period in the recovery from the KPG extinction, spanning roughly the first 100,000 years of the Paleocene, when the world was genuinely bleak, cold and dim and stripped of most of its former richness, a global landscape of ferns and ash and slow grey rivers and very little else. The survivors were living in a world reduced to a fraction of what it had been. And yet they persisted. They went on living in that reduced world, eating what was available, reproducing what they could, adapting one generation at a time to the specific conditions of the post-impact world, not grieving what was gone, not knowing what had been lost, just living. This is what survival actually looks like, most of the time. Not a dramatic triumph, not a great battle won, just the quiet daily work of being alive, of finding food, of finding warmth, of having your offspring do the same in a world that is slowly, almost imperceptibly becoming something new. The transformation of the post-KPG world was not a moment, it was a process, a long, slow, often difficult process of ecological rebuilding unfolding over millions of years, and the organisms doing the rebuilding did not know they were rebuilding anything. They were just living, being what they were in the world as they found it. The first mammals to venture out into the open landscapes that replaced the Cretaceous forests did not know they were exploring a new world. The first birds to colonize the recovering tropical forests of the early Eocene did not know they were participating in an evolutionary radiation of extraordinary significance. They were just living. And somehow, out of all that living, out of all those generations of organisms just being alive in the world as they found it, something extraordinary emerged. Let that thought carry you somewhere quiet. Let it be the last thing you hold before sleep. Not the drama of the impact, not the catastrophe, but the long, slow, patient work of recovery, the organisms in the darkness waiting, the world outside slowly changing, the morning eventually coming. You are a morning creature. You emerged eventually from a very long night, from 66 million years of slow and patient rebuilding. And you are here now, in another night, drifting toward another morning. Let the night hold you. Let the ancient persistence of life carry you into sleep. You are continuous with something that has been surviving for a very long time. It has never failed yet. And so we rest here, in that image, in that thought. The birds in the dark waiting for dawn. Us in the dark drifting towards sleep. And behind all of it, 66 million years of survival, of persistence, of life finding the cracks and coming through. We have travelled a very long way tonight. We began in the warm, lush, ancient world of the late Cretaceous, with its hadrosaurs and its tyrannosaurs, and its vast inland sea, and its flowering forests and its insects, and its small nocturnal mammals moving through the leaf litter. We walked as close as I dared to the moment of impact. We moved through the long winter and the slow, difficult, beautiful recovery. We looked at the debates, and the uncertainties and the questions that remain genuinely open, and we found the deep pattern, the thread of extinction and recovery that runs all the way through the history of complex life. And what I keep coming back to, at the end of all of it, is the title we started with, The Extinction, event that may not have ended life. It did not end life. It could not end life. Life is, it turns out, remarkably difficult to end, remarkably resilient, remarkably inventive, remarkably committed to persistence across every condition the universe has thrown at it. The story of life on Earth is not a story of fragility. It is a story of extraordinary stubbornness. There is something in that worth carrying into sleep, into the quiet of the night, into tomorrow. You're part of something very ancient and very persistent. You belong to a story that is far from finished. I want to take you somewhere you have never been. Not backward this time, not into the warm, insect-loud morning of the late Cretaceous, not to the coast of the inland seaway, not to the forests where the hadrosaurs move through ancient light. We have been there. We have stood in that world and felt its weight and watched its end. Now I want to take you into what came after, into the silence, into the long, strange, patient aftermath of catastrophe. Because there is a part of this story that most tellings skip over. The drama of the impact is compelling, and the eventual triumph of the mammals is compelling, and the beautiful arc from tiny burrowing creature to us makes a satisfying shape. But between those 2 points, between the burning sky of 66 million years ago and the flourishing world we inhabit now, there is a period of time that rarely receives the attention it deserves, a period of approximately 10 million years, during which the Earth was, in many of the ways that matter most, still figuring out what it was going to become. Let me describe the early Paleocene to you. It is perhaps 1 million years after the impact. The worst of it, the immediate heat pulse and the catastrophic fires and the great dying off of large animals, is over. The sulfur aerosols and the soot have largely settled from the upper atmosphere. The sun has returned to something approaching its former self. The temperature has crept back up toward a livable range. Not what it was before, not the warm, lush, tropical world of the late Cretaceous, but livable, by some organisms' standards at least. The landscape is strange in the way that places are strange after great loss. Not ugly exactly, not empty, but reduced, simplified, like a symphony played on 2 instruments instead of 80. You can hear the shape of what it was supposed to be, but the fullness is gone. The forests that had covered much of what is now North America and Europe and Asia are recovering, but slowly, and they are not the same forests. The towering angiosperms of the late Cretaceous, the ancient flowering trees with their elaborate canopy communities, and their intricate animal relationships built over millions of years of coevolution, those are largely gone. What has taken their place is younger, smaller, less complex. Pioneer species, early successional plants, fast-growing and opportunistic, filling the space with green but not yet replacing the depth. Ferns still dominate much of the ground layer. They will dominate it for thousands more years. The fern spike in the fossil record, that dramatic increase in spores immediately above the KPG boundary, grades slowly over tens of thousands of years into a more diverse signal as the flowering plants return. But the ferns are there first, as they have always been first, in every devastated landscape since before the dinosaurs existed. It is, in its own quiet way, beautiful. A world of ferns and low shrubs and the young, thin-stemmed trees of a recovering forest. Pale light filtering through a sky that is clearer than it was, but not yet the deep blazing blue of the old world. The air is cool. The seasons are more pronounced than they were in the late Cretaceous, because the warming influence of the vast shallow inland seas has been disrupted, because the climate is still in the process of finding a new equilibrium. And in this landscape, small things are moving. I want you to picture the mammals of the early Paleocene, not the mammals you know, not horses or bears or elephants or primates. Those are creatures of a later world, products of millions of years of evolution still to come. The mammals of the early Paleocene are something else entirely, something that, if you saw one, you might not immediately recognize as an ancestor of anything familiar. They are small, almost uniformly small. The largest of the survivors, the condylarths, the very first of the hoofed mammals, are no bigger than a large cat. Most are considerably smaller, rat-sized, shrew-sized. The great diversity of body sizes that will eventually characterize the Cenozoic mammal fauna, the elephants and the whales and the horses and the bears, that diversity does not yet exist. The ecological space for large-bodied mammals exists. The pressure to fill it is real and immediate. But evolution takes time, even when the pressure is urgent. So what you see in the early Paleocene is a world full of small, quick, opportunistic creatures scurrying through a recovering landscape, eating insects and seeds and roots and berries and each other, filling every crack and margin and corner of the available ecological space, experimenting, diversifying, making, in the language of evolutionary biology, an adaptive radiation. An adaptive radiation is what happens when a group of organisms suddenly finds itself with access to ecological space that was previously unavailable, when barriers that had constrained its diversification are removed, when the world suddenly is full of empty niches. The KPG extinction created the largest and most sudden opening of ecological space in the past 66 million years. Every large animal niche on every continent was simultaneously vacated. The role of large herbivore, vacant. The role of apex predator, vacant. The role of mid-sized omnivore, vacant. The role of large browser, large grazer, large pack hunter, all vacant, all suddenly available, all sitting empty like rooms in a house that has just been cleared, and the mammals walked in, not immediately, not in a single generation or a single century. But within a few million years, the fossil record shows an explosion of new forms, new body sizes, new dietary specializations, new locomotory strategies, new ways of being a mammal in a world that suddenly offered almost unlimited room to grow. There is a genus of early Paleocene mammals called Purgatorius. It appears in the fossil record within the first million years after the Cape Eek boundary in what is now Montana. It was small, mouse-sized perhaps, or slightly larger. It was probably arboreal, spending time in the recovering trees. It ate insects and fruit, and by most analyses, it sits very close to the base of the primate lineage, which is to say, the creature that would eventually give rise to monkeys and apes and humans was already, within 1 million years of the asteroid, experimenting with life in the trees of the post-impact world. 1 million years, in geological terms, that is tomorrow morning. But let me not rush past the difficulty of what came before that recovery, because there is a temptation, when telling any story of survival and eventual triumph, to compress the hard parts, to spend 2 sentences on the darkness and 20 on the dawn. And I want to resist that temptation, because the darkness matters. The duration of the difficulty matters. The specific texture of a world in the slow process of pulling itself back from the edge is not just background, it is the story. The ecological recovery from the KPG extinction took approximately 10 million years to reach something approaching the complexity of the world that preceded it. 10 million years. That is roughly 3 times the entire duration of human evolution from our earliest recognizable ancestors to today. It is not a short time. It is not a quick bounce back. In the oceans, the recovery was in some ways even slower than on land. The marine plankton, whose near total collapse in the aftermath of the impact had devastated the entire food web of the sea, took hundreds of thousands of years to begin rebuilding. The foraminifera, those tiny single-celled organisms whose chalk skeletons had been raining onto the ocean floor in such quantities during the Cretaceous that entire geological formations are made of their bodies, slowly diversified again. New species appeared, new ecological relationships formed, new food webs were constructed from whatever had survived. But the ocean of the early Paleocene was a ghostly place compared to what had come before. The ammonites were genuinely gone. Nothing replaced them. There is no modern group of spiral-shelled cephalopods that fills their ecological role. That particular experimental form, refined over 300 million years to extraordinary diversity, simply ceased to exist. The mosasaurs were gone, and the plesiosaurs, and the great marine reptile predators that had made the Cretaceous ocean such a dynamic and complex place. What replaced them, eventually, were the whales. But the whales would not begin their transition to marine life for another 15 million years, so the oceans of the early Paleocene were, in the top trophic levels, largely empty, enormous ecological space, silent. And the fish, patient and ancient and extraordinarily diverse, began to fill it. I want to stay for a moment with the concept of ecological silence, because I think it is one of the most important and least discussed aspects of the aftermath of any great extinction. An ecosystem is not just a list of species. It is a set of relationships. It is the intricate web of who eats whom, and who pollinates what, and whose carcass feeds which scavenger, and whose burrowing aerates the soil, and whose dung fertilizes the forest floor, and which predator's presence shapes the behavior of which prey in ways that cascade through the entire system. The relationships are not just ecological, they are evolutionary. The organisms in a mature ecosystem have been shaped by each other across millions of years. They are fitted together, adapted to one another's presence. When that web is destroyed, when 75 or 80% of the species in a system disappear simultaneously, what you are left with is not just fewer organisms. You are left with a set of broken relationships. Organisms that existed in the context of other organisms that are no longer there. Prey without predators, plants without pollinators, food webs with missing links. The ecological silence of the early Paleocene was not merely the absence of sound, it was the absence of relationship, the absence of millions of years of accumulated interaction, the absence of the context within which the surviving organisms had evolved. And the surviving organisms had to figure out one generation at a time what they were in a world that no longer contained most of what they had been shaped to inhabit. This is a kind of loss that is very difficult to put numbers on. You can count species, you can measure diversity indices, you can document the thinning of the fossil record above the KPG boundary. But the loss of relationship, the loss of ecological meaning, the sense in which an ecosystem is a whole that exceeds the sum of its parts, that is harder to quantify and harder to rebuild. It takes time. It takes the slow accumulation of new relationships, new coevolutionary pressures, new dependencies and new partnerships, and new forms of mutual exploitation and mutual benefit. It takes, in short, millions of years. And it happened. It happened because life persists, and the persistent forms find each other, and out of that finding something new is always constructed. There are survivors of the KPG extinction that I have not yet mentioned. Survivors whose stories are strange and in some cases almost comically counterintuitive. Survivors who complicate the tidy narrative of small beats large and warm-blooded beats cold-blooded, and flexible beats specialized. The snakes, for instance. Snakes are successful survivors of the KPG extinction and the Paleocene recovery in ways that are not immediately obvious. They are reptiles, which in the simplistic version of the story should make them losers. It was the reptiles that were supposed to die, and the warm-blooded mammals that were supposed to win. And yet snakes not only survived but diversified, explosively in the Paleocene and Eocene, filling predatory roles across every terrestrial and many aquatic ecosystems. There are today approximately 3,800 species of living snakes on every continent except Antarctica, in every habitat from rainforest canopy to open ocean. Why did the snakes make it when their large reptile relatives did not? Partly the familiar answer: small body, reduced metabolic requirements, ability to go for long periods without food, burrowing capability. A large snake can survive months without eating. In a world where food was scarce and unpredictable for years after the impact, this was an extraordinary advantage. But the snake story is also a reminder that the KPG survivors were not a coherent group with a single strategy. They were a diverse collection of organisms from many different lineages, united not by shared traits, but by the specific coincidence of whatever traits they happened to have with whatever the post-impact world happened to demand. There was no one right way to survive. There were many ways, all of them different, all of them accidental. The turtles survived, the lizards, many of them, the crocodilians, the frogs and salamanders, the small-bodied ectothermic tetrapods that the simple narrative would assign to the category of victims turned out to be, in many cases, among the most resilient survivors. And the insects. I want you to think about the insects. Insects had been on Earth since the Devonian. They had survived every mass extinction in the history of complex animal life. They had survived the Great Dying. They had watched the dinosaurs come and watched them go. And after the KPG impact, they rebuilt their extraordinary diversity faster than almost any other animal group. The early Paleocene insect fauna, though reduced, was already diversifying within hundreds of thousands of years of the boundary. And as the plants recovered and the flowers returned and the ecological niches for pollinators and decomposers and herbivores and parasites multiplied, the insects exploded into them. Today there are perhaps 1 million described species of insects. The actual number, including undescribed species, may be 10 times that. They constitute more than half of all known multicellular animal species. They are, by almost any measure, the most spectacularly successful animal group in the history of life on Earth. And they survived the KPG extinction the way they have survived everything. By being everywhere, by being diverse, by being small and numerous and reproductively prolific and adaptable beyond anything the larger animals could manage. The story of the ocean's recovery deserves its own quiet attention. 56 million years ago, roughly 10 million years after the KP impact, something extraordinary happened in the ocean that geologists call the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, or the PETM. A massive pulse of carbon dioxide entered the atmosphere and ocean from an uncertain source, possibly deep-sea methane hydrates destabilized by warming, possibly volcanic activity associated with the opening of the North Atlantic. The result was a rapid warming of global temperatures, perhaps 5 to 8 degrees Celsius in only a few thousand years. The ocean acidified. Many deep-sea organisms died. The world transformed again. But the PETM, as traumatic as it was, also accelerated something that was already underway. The warming triggered a burst of diversification in the recovering marine ecosystems. New niches opened in newly warm waters. Organisms that had been constrained by cool temperatures expanded their ranges. The tropical and subtropical oceans became richer, more diverse, more complex. And into those warming oceans, over the course of the Eocene, the first whales began their descent. I want to stay with the whales for a moment, because their story is one of the most extraordinary in all of evolutionary biology, and it happened in the world that the KPG extinction created. The earliest whale ancestors, the Pachycetids, were land mammals. They looked something like a slim-legged dog or wolf, with an unusually dense bone structure that may have helped them wade in shallow water. They lived along the shores of the ancient Tethys Sea in what is now Pakistan and India, approximately 50 million years ago. They ate fish, they waded, they occasionally swam, and their descendants, over the next 15 million years, became fully aquatic. The transition is documented in the fossil record in extraordinary detail. Ambulocetus, which could walk and swim, Rhodhocetus, which could barely walk but swam powerfully, Basilosaurus, fully aquatic but still retaining vestigial hind limbs, a serpentine predator up to 18 meters long, and then, by about 35 million years ago, the modern whale lineages, with their fully horizontal tail flukes and their streamlined bodies and their internal remnants of a pelvis that no longer attaches to anything. This transformation, from land mammal to the largest animal in Earth's history, happened in approximately 15 million years, a geological eye blink. It happened because the ecological space in the post-KP ocean was available, because the marine reptiles that had dominated that space for 160 million years were gone, and no other group had yet evolved to fill it, and the mammals, inheritors of the world, sent one of their lineages back into the water to try something new. The blue whale exists because the mosasaur went extinct. The ocean story after the KPG is, at its heart, a story of ecological space being filled by the wrong animals, by the mammals and the birds who had no business being in the ocean, who were terrestrial creatures by every prior measure of their history, who entered the water anyway because the water was there and the space was empty. And that is what life does with empty space. It fills it. Always. It fills it with whatever is available, whatever can be adapted, whatever can be pushed or pulled or gradually modified into a form that works. I want to tell you something about a woman standing at a cliff face in Tunisia. She is a geologist. She has been studying the KPG boundary for 20 years. She knows this particular outcrop the way a musician knows a piece of music they have played 1,000 times. Not just the structure of it, but the feel of it, the specific texture of each layer, the places where the rock does something unexpected. She runs her fingers across the boundary layer. It is perhaps 3 centimeters thick here, a dark grey smear of clay between the pale limestone below and the pale limestone above. Below, a limestone teeming with the shells of foraminifera, the tiny single-celled organisms whose calcium carbonate homes had been accumulating on the seafloor for millions of years. A fossil record so dense and so detailed that you can read the health of the ocean. From it, the temperature fluctuations and the productivity cycles and the slow drift of climate across millions of years. And then the boundary, the dark clay with its iridium and its shocked quartz and its tiny glass spherules from the impact, the chemical signature of a rock from outside our solar system, distributed across the entire planet, and above, almost nothing, a pale limestone nearly empty of fossils. The seafloor in the immediate aftermath of the impact was a sterile place. The plankton that should have been raining their shells down were dead or dying. The great carbon pump of the ocean, the process by which photosynthesizing plankton fix carbon from the surface waters and then sink it to the deep as their bodies decompose, had essentially stopped. She has shown me photographs of this boundary. I have seen others like it in museums and in geology textbooks, and every time I look at one, I feel something that I do not have quite the right word for, a kind of compression. The sense that time is not the smooth gradient we normally imagine, but something that can fold and crease and leave sharp edges. Below the line, a world. Above the line, an absence, and then slowly, a different world beginning. The geologist running her fingers across that dark clay is touching something that has no parallel in human experience. She's touching 66 million years of time compressed into 3 centimeters of stone. She's touching the precise moment when the entire trajectory of life on this planet pivoted. And she's made of what came after that pivot. We all are. There is a thought that keeps returning to me as I turn all of this over. The KPG extinction is often described as a boundary event, a dividing line, before and after, the end of one era and the beginning of another, and that is accurate as far as it goes. The geological periods are real things, defined by real changes in the fossil record, and the Cretaceous ending and the Paleocene. Beginning is one of the sharpest transitions in the entire Phanerozoic record. But there is another way to see it, not as a boundary but as a bridge. The organisms that survived the KPG extinction were not new inventions. They were not created by the catastrophe. They were old things that had been evolving and refining themselves across the Mesozoic world, living in the margins and the cracks and the deep water and the underground, shaped by the same world they would eventually inherit. Their survival was not a new beginning, it was a continuation. The birds that survived were dinosaurs. The mammals that survived were mammals. The fish that survived were fish. The ferns that survived were ferns. Life did not start over after the KPG extinction. It continued, transformed, reduced, reshaped, but continuous. The chain was never broken. It has never been broken, not once, in 3.5 billion years of life on this planet. Not by the Great Dying, which killed 96% of marine species and left the oceans nearly empty. Not by the end Triassic event. Not by the KP impact. In every case, through every catastrophe, something survived. And what survived was not just organisms, but possibility. The deep capacity of life to diversify and adapt and fill empty space and build complexity. That capacity is not breakable, or at least it has not broken yet. And that is the fact, the quiet, extraordinary, deep time fact that I want you to take with you into sleep tonight. 66 million years is a long time. I know I have said this before or something like it, but I want to approach it from a different angle now, because when we say 66 million years, we usually mean it as a measure of distance, as a way of saying how long ago the asteroid fell, how remote from us in time the world of the late Cretaceous was. But 66 million years is also a measure of becoming. Of all the generations, the uncountable billions of individual lives that fit between that dark morning when the sky fell and this night, now, when you're reading these words and drifting towards sleep, every one of those generations lived and ate and reproduced and died. Every one of them was shaped by the world they lived in and in turn shaped it slightly. Every one of them was a link in a chain that stretched backward through this KPG extinction and forward to you. The direct ancestors of every human being alive today include creatures that were present on the day the asteroid hit, not as some abstract phylogenetic connection, literally. There were individual animals alive on that day from whose lineages, without interruption, you are descended. They were small, they were frightened, or whatever the functional equivalent of frightened is in a creature that simple. They were in a burrow, or in the mud, or under a rock, and they survived, and their offspring survived, and their offspring's offspring, generation after generation across millions of years and multiple continents and ice ages and warming periods and habitat shifts and predation pressure and disease and competition. That chain of survival continued, unbroken, unremarked, simply happening, one generation at a time, until it produced you. There is a word in evolutionary biology, fitness. We say that organisms are selected for fitness, meaning that the traits that help organisms survive and reproduce are the traits that persist through generations. And fitness is always understood as fitness for the current environment, what helps you survive today, in the world as it currently is. But the KPG story suggests something deeper than that, something harder to articulate. The mammals that survived the KPG were fit for an environment that had not yet arrived. Their traits, small size, warm blood, generalist diet, burrowing behavior, rapid reproduction, were not selected by the post-impact world. They were selected across 150 million years of Mesozoic marginality. They were fit for a world the mammals could not have imagined and would never experience because they would be dead before it arrived. Their descendants were fit for it. And this is the deep magic of evolutionary inheritance. You carry in your body the solution to problems you have never faced. The accumulated wisdom of billions of years of survival is encoded in your immune system, and your pain response and your fever mechanism, and the way your blood clots, and the way your cells repair their own DNA. None of that evolved to solve your problems specifically. All of it evolved to solve the problems your ancestors faced long ago in worlds you will never see. And some of it will turn out to be exactly what is needed for the challenges ahead. This is not a guarantee. It is not a promise. Evolution does not make promises and does not care about outcomes. But it is a fact of deep history that the organisms that survived catastrophe were in possession of traits shaped by conditions they did not fully inhabit, and that those traits served them in ways that could not have been anticipated. The small mammal in its burrow did not know it was carrying the future, but it was. I want to end where we began, in the night, in the specific quality of darkness that falls when the day is done, and the mind begins to loosen its grip on the ordinary world and drift towards something deeper and older. There is a reason, I think, that stories about deep time feel most natural in the late hours. Something about the dark presses us toward large thoughts. Something about lying still, with the sounds of the world reduced to wind and distant traffic and the small movements of the house settling, opens the mind to scales of time that the busy daylight hours resist. The early mammals were primarily nocturnal, their large eyes adapted for low light, their whiskers sensitive to air pressure and texture, their noses calibrated to detect the chemical signatures of other creatures in the dark. All of these were adaptations for a life lived when the great reptiles were sleeping. When the world's top predators rested their enormous eyes and lowered their metabolism and released the landscape to the small and quick and alert. The night belonged to the mammals. It was their world, the only safe world they had. And when the asteroid fell and the great predators were gone, and the night and the day were equally available, the mammals carried their nocturnal gifts with them into the daylight. Their acute senses, their endothermy, their social complexity, built partly from the need to coordinate in the dark where visual communication is limited. Their capacity for learning, so much more useful to a small nocturnal creature navigating a complex environment than to a large diurnal one that can simply overwhelm its world with size. The night made us, not literally, not entirely, but more than we usually acknowledge, and the night, I think, still holds something of that old magic. The sense that in the dark, attended by ancient senses, the mind moves differently, follows different channels, becomes more honest, perhaps, about what it is and where it came from. So let me leave you with this. You are lying in the dark. Your day is behind you. All of it, the small frustrations, the unexpected kindnesses, the work undone and the work completed, the conversations you wish had gone differently and the ones you are glad happened, all of it is behind you now. The night has taken it. The day is over. And what remains, underneath all of that, what has always been there beneath the surface story of your life, is something much older. You are an organism. You are warm-blooded and small-brained by mammalian standards, and extraordinarily complex by the standards of the universe. You require food and warmth and sleep, and the company of your kind. You have an immune system refined across hundreds of millions of years of coevolution with pathogens. You have a pair of forward-facing eyes adapted very long ago for life in trees. You have hands with a precision grip that was shaped over millions of years by ancestors who needed to grasp branches and manipulate objects and examine the world at close range. Every one of those features is a legacy, a specific embodied inheritance from a particular set of ancestors who faced a particular set of challenges and survived. And the oldest and deepest of those inheritances goes back to a night very much like this one, 66 million years ago, when a small creature pressed itself against the cool, dark earth and waited for the world to change. It waited, and the world changed. And the small creature emerged. And here, Impossibly and improbably and magnificently you are. If this story has taken you somewhere quiet, if it has left you feeling, even briefly, the weight of deep time and the extraordinary contingency of your own existence, then it has done what it set out to do. The world that produced us is stranger and more beautiful than any story we could invent, and we are, all of us, still very much inside it. Good night. And thank you for travelling this far into the dark. Good night. Where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this.